Hi folks, hope you're okay today. We're just looking at this book, Fundamentalism by James Barr. This guy is a top academic, probably one of the world's premier academics. James Barr, Regius Professor of Hebrew in the University of Oxford. So he's been one of the most formidable critics of evangelicalism in the UK, and so he's a very eminent academic. And well, let's see what this eminent academic says. Page 156. Form criticism raises for fundamentalism a problem more serious than the accuracy of historical reporting in the Gospels. It raises completely different perspectives on the origin of Scripture. Scripture, it becomes possible to imagine, arose out of the church. So long as there were a few identifiable writers, it was possible to think that they were specially inspired. In distinction from all other persons in the church, though they received their experience within the church as writers, they spoke authoritatively from outside, as it were, to the church. But once the Scripture comes to be thought of as a product of a whole generation of nameless people, the idea of inspired writers becomes not so much as false as irrelevant. So I'll read that again. This is a top world-class academic, yeah? Top world-class academic, one of the most formidable academic critiques of evangelicalism, and this is what he says. But once Scripture comes to be thought of as a product of a whole generation, notice this, of a whole generation of, here it is, nameless people, the idea of inspired writers becomes not so much as false as irrelevant. Fundamentalist doctrine was formed, of course, at a time when nothing of this had been taken into consideration. So he's basically saying that evangelicalism is backward because it didn't take into consideration form criticism's idea that the Scriptures, and for example the Gospels specifically, were products of the early church, nameless communities who edited this material at a later date about Jesus and came up with some kind of mythological or fictional figure. That's basically what he's saying when he talks about these nameless groups of people, and the key is the groups of people. And that was typical of form criticism. I've done two very scholarly videos on Rudolf Bultmann. You can look at that on Lollard Preachers. So there's two very scholarly critiques of Rudolf Bultmann, who's behind the form criticism. Well, here's my main creme de la creme argument against form criticism and against Jerome Bast, and it's this, that he says, and I'll read it again, but once the Scriptures come to be thought of as the product of a whole generation of nameless people, the idea of the inspired writers becomes not so much false as irrelevant. Now this work, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and I've got many hundreds of videos about this book, so type in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Jason Burns, and you'll find hundreds of videos of me reflecting on this book. I've done so many analysis of this book, it's unbelievable. Richard Bauckham, and basically the whole argument of this book is against that statement. But once Scripture comes to be thought of as a product of the whole generation of nameless people, the idea of inspired writers becomes not so much a false as irrelevant. Basically what Bauckham shows is actually the Gospels were produced on eyewitness material, and he shows that tradition is culturally specific, which is also stated by what's his name, James Dunn in Jesus Remembered, massive work. It's culturally specific, and when you talk about culturally specific, we're talking about the first century, and when oral tradition was being passed on in culturally specific in the culturally specific situation of the first century, often there were key individuals who did what is called historiography oral tradition, who were the key people who wrote it down and made sure it was passed on. They were key individuals, and so Borkham goes back to Papias and other individuals in the early church, and shows that there was these key individuals who passed on the tradition. They were not nameless communities. And so it's reasonable to say that after the apostles there were key individuals that were given the tradition of handing down about the life of Jesus, and this would be based, if you look at the historical context of the first century, would be based on eyewitness material. Now, doing historical research, detailed historical research of the first century and looking at the cultural context completely debunks what this Oxford scholar has just said. And not only him, but also form criticism, and that's why form criticism has fallen on hard times over the last 20 years. So what we've done there is we've just demolished the top academic in the world from Oxford. We've just demolished him by showing you cutting edge research and talking about good scholarship in historical studies. And that's all you have to do. So he's basically demonizing, this top academic demonizing Christian evangelicals, calling them fundamentalists, talking about a scholarship that is now defunct and debunked. But he was saying that this scholarship that he had showed how backward the evangelicals were, but now we find that he is looking backward because the scholarship that he's using is now discredited. And this book has caused a stir within the academic world, and even now the debate has not been won or lost, because people are still having to grapple with this book in the academic world about the Gospels having eyewitness material. Thank you for listening, and take care.